She didn't belong there, and she knew it. Louisa Fenn had known it for 3 years, ever since she took the accounting job at Harrow and Crane Import Solutions, a company that moved luxury goods through the port of Baltimore, with the kind of efficiency that didn't come from good logistics software. It came from fear. Everyone who worked in that building moved the way people moved when they knew, without being told, that mistakes had consequences. Louisa moved quietly. She always had. She was 28 years old, round-faced and soft-armed, the kind of woman who got called sweet by people who didn't know her and invisible by people who did. She wore cardigans in the summer because the office air conditioning ran Arctic, and she kept her dark hair pinned back so it didn't fall across her reading glasses while she reconciled accounts. She ate lunch at her desk. She didn't go to happy hours. She didn't ask questions about the executive floor, even though the executive floor had a separate elevator that required a key card she would never be issued, even though some of the line items she processed had origin ports that didn't match their declared contents, even though every few months someone from legal would come down and quietly collect a hard drive from one of the servers. She wasn't stupid. That was the thing people always got wrong about her. They looked at the cardigan and the reading glasses and the careful way she kept her eyes on her work, and they assumed she didn't understand what she was looking at. She understood exactly what she was looking at. She just understood, too, the difference between knowing something and saying something. That difference had kept her employed for 3 years. It kept her employed right up until the night she stayed late to finish a quarterly audit and found the discrepancy. It was in the shipping ledger for March, a column of numbers that had been processed twice, routed through a holding account in Delaware, and then quietly zeroed out. Someone had been very good at hiding it. Not good enough. Louisa had a photographic memory for numbers, always had, and the sequence nagged at her, the way a wrong note nags at a musician. She pulled the source files. She cross-referenced. She sat in her chair in the empty office, the city lights of Baltimore, going orange and distant through the windows, and she realized what she was looking at. Someone inside the company was skimming from Harrow and Crane, not from the company's legitimate revenue, from the other money. The money that moved in specific increments at irregular intervals. The money that Louisa had spent 3 years carefully, deliberately not looking directly at. Someone was stealing from the kind of men who didn't call the police when they discovered a theft. She should have closed the file. She almost did. Instead, because she was who she was and her brain would not let her leave a wrong number alone, she printed the summary sheet, tucked it in her bag, and finished the audit. She turned off her desk lamp at 9:47 in the evening. The parking garage was mostly empty, which was how she noticed the 2 men standing beside her car. Rafferty Mace had not built his empire by being sentimental. The men who worked for him knew this. The men who worked against him learned it quickly, or they didn't get the chance to learn anything else. He had come up hard through the Baltimore docks at 19, the kind of hard that leaves marks you don't see in mirrors, and by 38, he operated half the private import infrastructure on the eastern seaboard, and had the kind of institutional respect in certain circles that doesn't come with plaques or press releases. He was sitting in the back of his car reading quarterly projections when his phone rang. The display said Croft, which was the name of his head of internal security. "We have a problem at Harrow and Crane," Croft said. Mace set down the projections. "Spetisai, the overnight audit flagged an anomaly. One of the accounting staff found it. She was working late. She printed the summary. Which anomaly?" A pause. The Delaware routing. The temperature in the car didn't change, but something in the air around Mace seemed to shift anyway. The driver, a careful man named Pellegrino, who had been with Mace for 11 years, glanced once in the rearview mirror and then fixed his gaze straight ahead. "What did you do with her?" Mace asked. "We brought her in." She's at the Locust Point warehouse." "Sir?" Croft hesitated, which was unusual for him. She didn't run. When the boys found her in the garage, she asked them who she was being taken to. "That's all," she said. "No screaming, no bargaining," she just asked. Mace considered that. "Is she hurt?" "Brodsky got rough with her before I could." "Is she hurt?" "Croft, her cheekbone," Croft said carefully, "and her wrist." The inside of the car went very quiet. "Tell Brodsky not to touch anything else that belongs to me," Mace said. "Until I decide what belongs to me." He put the phone down. He looked out the window at the dark harbor, at the lights of the cranes that moved containers across the dock, at the city that had made him, and that he had, in every way that mattered, returned the favor of making. "Locust Point," he said. Pellegrino was already turning the car around. Louisa had decided, somewhere between the parking garage and the warehouse, that she was not going to cry. She had a practical mind. Crying would blur her vision, which she needed for observing details. Details were the only advantage she had right now, and she intended to use every one of them. The warehouse was operational. She could smell brine and machine oil, could hear the distant rhythmic groan of dock equipment somewhere beyond the walls. Industrial lighting, the kind that hummed, wooden crates stacked in rows along the north wall. Recent arrivals she hadn't processed yet. 2 guards near the south door. One near the corridor to her right, which she was guessing led to a loading dock based on the draft coming through it. Her cheek hurt. Her wrist hurt worse. She'd twisted it when the one called Brodsky had grabbed her too hard in the garage, and she'd had the instinct to pull away, which had been a mistake. She'd corrected that instinct immediately and gone still, which had seemed to confuse him. She was sitting in a chair in the center of the warehouse floor. They hadn't tied her. She filed that away. She heard the car before she saw the headlights through the high transom windows. A smooth engine, expensive. Then the side door opened and she understood from the way every man in the room straightened that whoever had just walked in was the person who would decide what happened to her. She saw the suit first. Dark, Italian, impeccably cut. Then the hands, which were large and unhurried. And then the face, which she had seen before in exactly one photograph. The kind of photograph that wasn't widely circulated. Rafferty Mace. She had suspected for about 14 months that the company she worked for was a front. She had suspected for approximately 11 months that it was his front. She had spent those 11 months reconciling herself to the reality of her situation and behaving accordingly, which meant doing her job extremely well, keeping her eyes on her work, and making herself as structurally necessary and personally ignorable as possible. It had mostly worked. He crossed the warehouse floor without hurrying, the kind of man who had never needed to rush anywhere in his life, because the world had learned to wait for him. He was taller than she'd expected from the photograph, broader, with the dark coloring of someone with Mediterranean blood, and a face that might have been handsome if it weren't currently arranged into an expression of absolute controlled neutrality. He stopped 6 feet from her chair. His eyes dropped to her face, to her cheek. To be specific, and something happened in them. A flicker of something that Louisa's brain catalogued carefully suppressed anger, which was interesting and possibly relevant. He did not look away to find Brodsky. But Brodsky, across the room, took one small step backward. "Miss Fenn," Mace said. His voice was even, low, the kind of voice that didn't need to get louder to be heard over anything. "Mr. Mace," she said. Her own voice was steady. She was proud of that. His head tilted slightly. He had not, she realized, expected her to know his name. "The summary sheet," he said. "You printed it?" "Yes." "Why?" Louisa looked at him carefully. "Because the numbers were wrong and I cannot leave wrong numbers alone. It's a professional defect." The ghost of something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. "What do you intend to do with what you know?" "I intend," she said, "to answer whatever questions you have, accurately and completely. and then go home and never speak of any of this again. Mace studied her. He had spent 20 years reading people for a living, reading them the way she read ledgers, finding the misalignments between what they said and what they meant. And what he found when he read Louisa Fenn was nothing he expected. There was no calculation in her, no angling. The fear was there. Yes, the kind that wasn't visible on the surface, but was present in the slight rigidity of her spine, the deliberate evenness of her breathing. She was absolutely terrified. She was also being completely honest with him. That was unusual enough to be interesting. "The Delaware account," he said. "You found it by cross-referencing the March ledger against the source files. The sequence was processed twice with a 14-hour gap. Whoever did it redistributed the excess through 4 shell accounts before zeroing it out. They were very good." She paused. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I was better." Ah. Mace looked at her for a long moment. "You know who did it?" It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "I have a suspicion. I'd need access to the February and January source files to confirm it, and the wire transfer records for the corresponding dates." Silence. The warehouse groaned around them. Somewhere beyond the south wall, the harbor moved against the pilings. "Croft," Mace said, without looking away from her. The man who had been standing at the edge of the room moved forward. He was compact and watchful, 50-something, with the eyes of someone who'd spent a long time looking for trouble and finding it. "Get her what she needs," Mace said. "Set her up in the back office." Croft's expression said several things that he was professionally experienced enough not to say aloud. Mace finally looked away from Louisa, and when he did, he looked at Brodsky. Just looked. That was all. Brodsky went very still. "Go home, Brodsky," Mace said quietly. "I'll be in touch." The way he said it, the words meant something else entirely. The back office was a repurposed shipping manager's room, utilitarian and cramped, with a metal desk and a computer so old it had a disk drive. Louisa sat down, cracked her knuckles, ignored the pain in her wrist, and asked for access to the secure network. She got it. She worked for 4 hours. She was distantly aware that Mace remained in the building. She could hear his voice occasionally, the low controlled cadence of it, though never the words. She was aware that Tucson stood in the doorway of her office at all times, but never interfered with what she was doing. She was aware of a cup of coffee appearing at her elbow at some point after midnight, black with 2 sugars, which was how she took it, which meant someone had checked, which was its own kind of information. She found what she was looking for at 1:23 in the morning. She pushed back from the desk and called out, "I need Mace." There was a moment of silence from the doorway. Then one of the guards disappeared, and 2 minutes later Mace came in. He looked at the screen. She had pulled the relevant records and flagged them in sequence. The February irregularity, the January pattern, the connection to an internal access code that belonged to exactly one person in the Harrow and Crane organizational structure. "Your chief financial officer," she said. "Preston Gale. He's been doing it for 14 months. Not big amounts, small enough to look like rounding errors if no one was paying attention. But consistent. He's routed approximately $900,000 through 6 separate accounts." Mace looked at the screen. His hands, she noticed, were very still at his sides. "You're sure?" he said. "The access logs have his authentication code on every instance. He changed the entry times manually, but he didn't account for server-side timestamped verification. It's like," she paused, tried to find a comparison that would translate. "It's like writing a fake receipt. You can backdate the date, but you can't change when the cash register opened." Mace looked at the screen for another moment. Then he looked at her. In the flat overhead light of the office, with her cheek bruised purple, and her reading glasses slightly askew, and her cardigan wrinkled from hours of hunching over the desk. Louisa Fenn looked exhausted and precise and entirely unintimidated, and Rafferty Mace had the peculiar experience of not knowing what to say. This had not happened to him in a very long time. "Your cheek," he said finally. "It's fine. It isn't, it will be," she said. "It's not the first time someone's been rough with me. I'm harder to break than I look." He believed her. He wasn't sure why, but he believed her completely. "There's a doctor on call," he said. "Pellegrino will take you. I'd like to go home first." A pause. After the doctor. Louisa looked at him. She was too tired to manage anything strategic, which meant what came out was honest. "Does this mean I'm not a problem that needs solving?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile again. She was starting to think that was as close as he got. "You solved a problem for me tonight, Miss Fenn," he said. "I tend to remember that kind of thing." She nodded once and started shutting down the computer. "Your wrist," he said. She looked down at it. It had swollen during the past 4 hours and gone from aching to something more specific and unpleasant. "Maybe the doctor first," she allowed. She went back to work on Monday. She wasn't sure she should. She spent most of Sunday sitting on her couch with her wrist wrapped and an ice pack against her cheek, going back and forth on it. She had looked into the center of something she'd spent 3 years carefully not looking at, and the reasonable thing, the smart thing, was to type up a letter of resignation and start applying to accounting firms in cities that were not Baltimore. But her rent was due. She was 3 years into a very good pension structure, and she had spent 3 years building exactly the kind of institutional knowledge that would be extremely difficult to replace, which she suspected was the primary reason she was still breathing. That and the coffee. The coffee had 2 sugars. Someone had checked. She went back on Monday. She sat at her desk. She put on her reading glasses and she opened the quarterly audit she'd been working on before the world had interrupted it, and she went back to finding the things that didn't add up. Preston Gale's office on the executive floor was empty. No one mentioned it. Louisa did not ask. 3 weeks passed, then 4. Life arranged itself back into its regular shape, or something at her desk. She ate lunch at her desk. She went home at 6. She did not receive any further late-night invitations to warehouse offices, which she took as a positive sign. What she did receive on a Thursday afternoon was a visit from Croft. He appeared at the entrance to her office, the real one, in the main building, with the good lighting and the frosted glass partition, and stood there in his careful way until she noticed him. "Miss Fenn, Mr. Mace would like a word." The executive elevator, she discovered, required a keycard that Croft produced and swiped without fanfare. The executive floor was all dark wood and low light, and the specific, expensive silence of rooms where significant decisions were made. Mace's office was at the end of the hall, and his assistant, a young man named Quincy, who had the bearing of someone trained in 3 languages and the ability to discreetly neutralize a threat, showed her in without comment. Mace was standing at the window when she entered. The Baltimore waterfront spread behind him, midday light on the harbor. He looked the same as he had in the warehouse, except that he was less alarming in daylight. And then she looked at him more carefully and decided that wasn't actually true. "Miss Fenn," he said, "sit down." She sat. He turned from the window and sat across from her, not behind his desk but in the chair across the low table, which put them at the same level. She noticed that. She noticed most things he said. "I want to offer you a position," he said. "The CFO role is vacant. I need someone who can do what you did, find what shouldn't be there. Someone who can keep the 2 sides of this operation clean and separate and intact." He paused. "Someone I can trust." Louisa looked at him. "That's a significant amount of trust to place in someone you've known for 3 weeks." "I've had you looked into thoroughly," he said. There was something almost apologetic in it. "Almost. Of course you have. You've been doing this for 20 years. You've never filed a suspicious activity report, never cooperated with any inquiry, never spoken to anyone outside the appropriate channels. I've also never worked for the mob before," she said. "Technically." The corner of his mouth. Again. "Technically." If I say no, he looked at her steadily. You go back downstairs and keep doing what you've been doing. I'm not in the habit of threatening people who've done me a service. She believed him. She realized. Believed him from the moment he'd looked at her cheek in the warehouse, and something human had moved through his face. The salary, she said. He named a number. She made sure her face didn't do anything. Benefits, she said. Comprehensive. I'll want it in writing, obviously. She thought about the apartment she could afford. She thought about the pension plan she'd been building, and how this number made it look quaint and endearing. She thought about the very large, very specific thing she was agreeing to, and the very specific kind of man sitting across from her. There's a condition, she said. He waited. No one touches me. No Brodsky situation. No rowing up the accountant when something goes wrong. I am not interchangeable with the cargo. She held his gaze. If I work for you, I work for you as a professional, not as a problem. Something shifted in Mesa's expression. Not the almost smile this time, something quieter and more serious. Brodsky is no longer employed, he said, and no one in my organization will put their hands on you again. You have my word. I want it in the employment contract, too. A beat. You can have it. She nodded once. Then yes, I accept. It was not a simple life. She had never expected it to be. The work was demanding in ways that regular accounting was not. She was managing 2 sets of books simultaneously, keeping the legitimate import business exactly clean, enough to be uninteresting to outside auditors, while also accounting for the movement of money that traveled unnamed through channels. She was careful to never act about directly. She was good at it. She had been made, it turned out, for exactly this kind of careful, divided attention. She learned the rhythms of the organization. She learned which names to remember and which to forget. She learned that Croft, for all his watchful severity, would bring her aspirin without being asked when she was running numbers past midnight, and that Quincy upstairs was unexpectedly funny, and that the morning delivery drivers from the docks who came up to sign paperwork were almost always hungover on Fridays. She learned Mace, not intentionally, or not entirely intentionally, but he had an office 40 feet from hers now, and he was the kind of man who created gravity. You were aware of him the way you were aware of a change in weather, something in the atmosphere shifting before you saw the clouds. He was in the building most days by 7, gone by 9 most nights, and the hours between were disciplined and relentless. He did not raise his voice. He did not waste motion. He made decisions with the kind of calm that came either from supreme confidence or from simply not having enough fear left in him to be cautious. He also, she gradually noticed, watched her. Not conspicuously, not in any way she could have pointed to if asked, but she would look up from her desk and find him passing in the hall, and his eyes would go to her, before he corrected and looked elsewhere. She would be in a meeting and feel his attention on her even when he wasn't speaking to her. 3 months in, he began stopping in her office in the late evenings, not with questions, not with instructions, just stopping, leaning in the doorway, asking if she'd eaten. She hadn't, usually. She forgot to eat when she was working. He started sending food up from the restaurant 2 blocks over, the Italian one that had no sign and a waiting list. Louisa would previously have waited 3 years to be on. He did not announce this. The food simply appeared. She ate it and did not comment, because she was a practical woman and the food was extraordinary. 4 months in, she found herself looking for him too. She shut that down immediately. She was realistic about herself, about who she was, what she looked like, the space she occupied in any room. She was the accountant. She was useful. That was the basis of everything. And she was not going to muddy it by imagining that the man who could have anyone, who carried the weight of an empire in his posture, was watching her office doorway because of anything other than professional surveillance. She was very good at lying to herself about numbers. She was, it turned out, worse at it about people. The attempt came on a Tuesday in October. She was getting into the parking garage elevator when the man stepped in behind her. She registered him half a second before the doors closed. Wrong shoes for the neighborhood, wrong kind of deliberate about his movements. And then the elevator stopped between floors, and she had about 3 seconds to understand what was happening. His name, she would learn later, was Tanner. He worked for a competitor family out of Philadelphia, who had decided that Mace's books were a vulnerability, and that removing the person who kept them would create productive chaos. What he had not accounted for was Louisa. She was a plus-size woman in her late 20s who sat behind a desk all day, and she had also grown up in East Baltimore with 2 older brothers, and had spent 20 years quietly observing everything around her in environments that punished inattention. She was not going to make the mistake she'd made in the garage with Brodsky. She was not going to try to pull away. She drove her elbow into his sternum before he had his hands all the way on her, and when he grabbed anyway, she hooked her foot behind his ankle and put her full weight into the turn, and they both went down hard against the elevator wall. She got to the emergency button before he got his feet under him, and she held that button down and screamed. Elevator started moving again. He ran when the door 6 opened. He was limping. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely dial Croft's number. Croft arrived in 4 minutes. Mace was with him. She was sitting on the parking garage floor with her back against the concrete wall and her knees drawn up. And she was not crying. She had decided not to cry, but she was shaking in the specific way that happened after adrenaline, and she was not managing the professional composure she usually managed. Mace crouched down in front of her. He was in his evening clothes, which meant she had pulled him from something, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before. Controlled, still controlled, but underneath it, something that looked almost like, "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." Her voice was not steady this time. Not badly. He didn't. "I got to the button before Louisa." She stopped. He had not used her first name before. Something about it made the shaking worse, which was counterproductive. "Look at me," he said. She did. His eyes were dark, the color of deep water, and what was in them was not what she'd expected. Not calculation, not the cool professional assessment of an asset under threat. It was something rawer than that, something she had been specifically telling herself not to see for 4 months. "I have you," he said. "Do you understand? I have you." She swallowed. "I know," she said. "I know that. They won't touch you again. I promise you that." She believed him. She believed it the way she believed a proof when the numbers aligned, with the particular certainty that comes from everything checking out, from the evidence pointing only one direction. "I'm still shaking," she said, which was not a useful thing to say. "I know." He sat down on the concrete floor across from her, which was an extraordinarily undignified thing for a man in a $7,000 suit to do, and he sat there with her until the shaking stopped. It took 23 minutes, she tracked it. He told her, 3 days later in her office, with the door closed, not in the way she might have expected a man like him to tell someone something, not with the careful orchestration of power, not with the management of outcomes. He told her the way people tell things when they have run out of reasons not to. "I've known you were going to be a problem," he said, "since the night in the warehouse." She looked up from her spreadsheet. "Not that kind of problem." He was standing in front of her desk, hands in his pockets, and he looked, for the first time since she'd known him, not entirely certain of something. "You sat in that chair, and you gave me your name before I asked for it. You asked what I needed to know, and I thought," he stopped, started again. "I thought, there is a person who is exactly what they appear to be. I didn't know what to do with that." Louisa set down her pen. "Rafferty," she said. He went still at his name. "I've been watching you for 4 months," she said carefully, in the precise way she handled things that could go wrong if mishandled. "Not because it was relevant to my job. I've been watching you because I couldn't stop." She held his gaze. I'm telling you this because you're about to tell me something, and I want the accounting, to be honest. He came around the desk. She had time to think. He is going to put his hand on my face, and I am going to hold completely still. And then he did, and she did, and the warmth of it moved through her, with the specific quality of something she had wanted for a long time, and worked very hard not to want. You're the smartest person in every room you've ever been in, he said, and you've spent your whole life pretending not to be. It's safer. Not anymore, he said. Not with me. She looked at him. At the face that had frightened her, and then confused her, and then, over 4 months of late nights and Italian food, and a man sitting on a parking garage floor in a $7,000 suit because she was shaking, something else entirely. I want it in writing, she said. He laughed. Actually, laughed. Not the corner of the mouth thing she'd catalogued, but the real version, low and sudden and surprised, and it transformed his face into something she hadn't seen before. She liked it more than was strategically advisable. You'll have it, he said, and kissed her. The Tanner situation was resolved. She did not ask how. She was an accountant, not an investigator, and she had decided, carefully and deliberately, where the boundaries of her professional curiosity lay. Preston Gale was never found, which she also filed away without comment. What she did ask about, 2 weeks later, when the dust had settled and she had handed her reading glasses and her spare cardigan, and her mug, with the chip in the handle to the office next to his, was the coffee. The night in the warehouse, she said, someone brought me coffee, 2 sugars. He was reading a report and did not look up. Your file said you take it black with 2 sugars. My file. You'd been in the building 3 years. Of course we had a file. She considered this. The file said I take it black with 2 sugars. Yes, that's very specific. He turned a page. I'm a thorough person. Louisa looked at him. This man who had built an empire out of meticulous attention and careful ruthlessness, who had sat on a concrete floor for 23 minutes because she was shaking, who had her coffee order in a file and had made sure it was right. You noticed me, she said. He set down the report. He looked at her directly, the way he always did when something actually mattered, with the full attention that most people never turned toward her. I noticed you, he said, from the day you started. She thought about 3 years of eating lunch at her desk and keeping her eyes on her work and making herself structurally necessary and personally ignorable, and the particular strange grief of realizing that some of it at least had not worked at all. You could have said something, she said. You weren't ready, he said, and I wasn't careful enough yet. She thought about that for a while. Then she put her reading glasses back on and went back to the numbers, and he went back to his report, and the harbour outside went grey-green in the October light, and Louisa Fenn, who had spent her whole life making herself small in rooms where she didn't think she fit, quietly began to take up exactly the amount of space she'd always deserved.